Okay. Happy New Year, everybody. Can you hear me okay with that microphone, or this is
very hollow.
hollow? Okay.
Is it going through speakers?
Yeah, it is.
I can hear it.
Okay. We could turn it up if we should. Or...
I think you can do it without Dave.
No, we need to record.
No.
Yeah, well, he's close enough
We'll
though.
try it.
Yeah.
I'll try it anyway and see how it goes. Okay. We have new facilities, as you see, and we've got new signage out there. I think that worked out well. Goes with our tablecloths. Where's our tablecloth person? oh, thank you. I got too many things I hold on.
I can move the slide if you want.
Okay.
Use the microphone.
Yeah.
So we're going to be here on Tuesdays, 6:30. Try that for a while. We mainly started on Tuesdays at this time to match up with the French genealogy group. They're open till 6 o'clock. So if you wanted to go in and view their records and then come down here after, that's sort of the rationale of why we went and changed from Monday nights to Tuesday nights. So, and it's nice to see Malcolm here. He made it.
Well, I'm following your lead.
Okay.
You
had another event, I thought.
Well,
so.
yes, and see, this is a conflict. We have to decide every Tuesday night whether or not, which one wins.
So it depends on our speaker.
Yeah. Well, I've heard of this guy.
Yeah. Okay.
We can't be in the same building.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me clear up a couple of housekeeping things before we get to our guest speaker. We're recording this. That's what Cindy's doing here with the camera and the microphone, and we then put it on YouTube. So if you ever wanted to go back and see Art's slides to what was that website that he put up there, you can find the website that way. So the Kent branch. How many have been up to the Kent branch in Chatham at the Chatham Public Library? So another very good place. You can actually go see their books. Here we can't see ours. So
I found Ancestry there too. They've got it.
Yeah.
My wife's back to the UELs.
Very good.
Now we're not going to claim ULs, but they were born in Pennsylvania in the late 1700s and came to Kent County.
Yes.
That sort of sounds like a UAL to me.
Very good. So something for you to do over the winter. Anyway, they have a September 13th is their Friday night event, and it's they've got Dr. Teasdale from the University of Windsor. You've got the University of Windsor?
Yeah, he left for a while, but he's back.
Yeah, there's a theme there. Anyway, he's going to talk about his book, and he had talked to our group last year on that as well, if some of you were there. So also bring some money with you and buy the book and support the local research.
Whoa.
Maybe just turn that one off.
Step away from the speaker.
Right?
Use the speaker.
Maybe it was a glitch. Okay, it's at the McKinley Funeral Home, and it starts at 7 o'clock. So nice drive up to Chatham. You can have dinner ahead of time and then go over to the event. So, and they always have snacks there. So,
Always have snacks.
yeah, I'm a member, so I go up.
Come visit the room beforehand. It's open at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, so yep, a good place to go if you've never been there. The Detroit Genealogical Society. How many are members there? Yeah, and how many? So they have free events it's the second Saturday of every month, and they have really good speakers. It's well worth going over to the Detroit Public Library. It's in the lower level. They open at 10 o'clock. There's free parking just to the side in the staff parking lot. It opens at 10, and their events start at 10:30. And it's a good place to network with other researchers and to really learn what they have over there at the Burton Collection. So, Linda.
I was just going to say part of that presentation includes the Burton gentleman is going to be taking people through the Burton Collection and just give them a little tour.
Oh, very good. Okay, so yeah, and some of you have been there. We've had tours over, carpooling over there. So, also another good organization to join as well. It's like $25 a year or something. It's fairly inexpensive, and they give the newsletters. The last newsletter I think I saw was like 160 pages. It's like a book. So they put out a lot of good stuff. Maybe it just doesn't like this changing. It seems to happen when I change this.
Yeah, move there, yes.
I think it's this thing that's causing it. So again in Chatham, the Family History Fair is going to be again, I think this is the third or fourth year? Third year. It's at the Chatham Public Library on the first and second floor, and have speakers. They've had art there giving presentations. I know you can't read this, but we're going to post that on Facebook and on our website so you can get more details. And that's next Saturday, week Saturday. Again, another nice drive up to Chatham, or take the train. I've taken the train. It's you hop on at 9 o'clock and you get there at 10, and you can get a round trip ticket too. So we don't want to lose you. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all that, but you'll be able to get it. I think I'll try. Okay. Harrow. How many have been down to Harrow? Another good place to go if you've never been. Really good people down there, great information. They don't put a lot of stuff online, so you really have to go down there to see their books. Art was telling me some of their records are on at Wayne, or Fort Wayne. Is that what you were saying?
So some of their publications.
Publications,
So,
okay.
yeah, Fort Wayne.
Yeah.
Fort Wayne seems to have everything.
Yeah.
For the local area.
Another good place to visit if you've never gone. So, and the Detroit Genealogical Society goes once a year. They have a bus trip, and actually they've said we could join in with them on that event if people were interested. So they have room for about 10 or 12 extra people on the bus, at least in the last time. So, and I went for the first time this year. It was fantastic. So I'm hoping to go again. So Harrow have theirs usually on a Thursday. I believe that's probably a Thursday at 1:30, and they're going to be talking about Bablo. How many have not been to Bablo? How many have worked at Bablo? How many went on dates at Bablo? Okay. Anyway, it might be an interest. They have really good talks. They have nice bakery goods there as well that you can eat and stuff for donations. So, well worth it. I know we've got a couple that go there quite regularly, so so something to try. Oh, and that one, Ayers is at their community center. It's you come off Main Street and you go back to the arena, and it's right inside the same building. So, so our next presentation, we have we put out these flyers as to what's the next event. They're back on the table. Michelle's put these together. So the next one in October, we have Derek Blonde coming from Detroit, and he's going to talk about basically the connecting the dots of the family migrations, mainly in Detroit, but he's going to try to get some Canadian content in there as well. I've heard him talk over in Detroit, and he's excellent. And so it's really, we were surprised. He said, yeah, he'd come and give us a talk. So he's got a list of things, and this is the one we selected out of all of his different talks and everything. So again, I think it might be interesting just to see, well, how did the Indian trails, the military routes, and everything else. And I've been to one we've seen it on the railway trains, and how it moved people. So I'm assuming some of that might be. He's going to talk about the railways as well, but. You start to collect the dots. Well, that's how people got from Pennsylvania up to Tilbury, and it starts to make sense then. And then you can sort of maybe follow the route or something. So it might spark some ideas of where you might want to research. So again, I think that's going to be a very good talk. We may have to sell tickets, we think. Okay, anybody go to Route Tech?
I've been, it's amazing.
Yeah. Have you've been?
No,
No, you've never been.
It's amazing.
It's if you like crowds, it's good. Yeah, but yeah, they have a lot. I mean, it's huge. It's what, about a 4-hour flight from here, and
yeah.
so out of Detroit,
Yeah.
and or are they leaving from Toronto?
We left from Toronto.
Okay,
Yeah.
so if you go through OGS, you'd go fly out of Toronto. With the group.
And they have a little discount, so OGS has partnered with this company and they're putting these packages together. And I think this past year there was 15 OGS members from all across Ontario that went. So they kind of went as a group, so you're not all on your own, right? So it's yeah.
One of these days I'll go. But still putting kids through school. Okay, conference. Oh, our conference in Hamilton next year. How many went to the London one? It was so close. It was great. Did you like it? The venue was great, wasn't it?
Very good.
Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. And so I assume they're going to do something similar. It's got a mind of its own.
Yeah, it
I
does.
didn't do anything. Anyway, Hamilton, June 5th to 7th. You can take a train up there, I believe. Carpooling. They usually have room discounts at the hotels or at the university, probably is close by. So keep it in mind. They're really, I find them well worth it. Just meeting and greeting. I think they put me to work last time though in London. I was at the table all the time. So, and then,
Careful what you wish for.
yeah, it was still enjoyable. I liked it. So, okay, next one is our 40th anniversary. We've got a few founding members in the crowd here. They're going to be here November 12th, which is a Tuesday, and we're going to invite some dignitaries. Hopefully, the mayor will come and present us with our 40th anniversary certificate. And we're putting together lists of all the individuals that put this group together, and the ones that started us on cemetery duty and going to citations and indexing and yeah, thanks a lot for that. Anyway, it has been enjoyable to keep it going. So, so we'll hear about how they got started maybe, and we're just putting together plans on what we're going to do that day. So we'll keep you posted. And I think that's all you're going to hear from me. Is it? Volunteers needed. How many like to clean cemetery headstones? How many would want to learn? Every Tuesday from, we get there about 8:45 and we leave about 11:15. But right now you know, if you've never been to the Windsor Grove Cemetery, that's well worth meeting us there some Tuesday morning. But these things are so old, it's amazing. Some of the, today we unearthed at least 5 headstones that have been buried probably for 50 years. So we were able to, you know, delicately get the dirt off and everything else. But yeah, if you like mud and dirt, again, come on, we'll keep you busy. And if you're really, really strong, you can lift headstones. That would be useful.
Do they give you a map or something? How do you find these headstones that are buried like that?
You do row at a time.
We're doing a row at a time, and then you look, there should be something there. So we start digging, you know. Put it. I have a.
Because I've gone and you think, well, maybe they just didn't have a headstone, but these, that sounds.
Yeah, it's just
Okay.
by luck. And sometimes you'll see just a little piece of it, and you start unearthing it. And sometimes you've unearthed it all, and it's face first. You're looking at the backside, so it's, and usually they're very, very heavy, and it's hard to pick them up. So we just sort of take a picture of it, and we're going to get the burial records and try to map it out and figure out who's actually there. So that, Linda, that's your job in October. We're going to scan them all for the.
We need to get somebody to come in and do a demonstration on dowsing.
Oh, that would be cool. Yeah, Steve Fulton does that, where he's actually demonstrated he can find the bodies. But we have the University of Windsor can actually come in with their ultrasound machines and could map it out electronically to determine if there's anything there. So, which I was thinking about today. Here I'm going along. Is there a body there? One of these days somebody will answer. Anyway, so that's one thing we're doing is we're out there. We've got a crew of where's Pat's our leader. 5 or 6 people out there now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're.
The summer's been good. We've had lots of help.
We had some grade school children out there helping out. They were great. I had my dog out there, but he got kicked out. So. Seriously. Anyway, we have a good time. We're at Howard Avenue in Giles. Just look for the flag. We'll be in there someplace, usually in the front. And actually, you know, if we have other jobs, if you like typing or computer websites, we can keep you busy doing that. Like Twittering, Facebook, things you can do at home if you want. So you don't necessarily have to come home and get dirty. So, but okay, I think that's all. Oh. I keep forgetting what else is in there. This is back to school time. I know you can't read this, but this is from 1923, and it's, I guess generally back then it was mainly female teachers, and they're saying, when we hire you as a teacher, you can't be married, you can't go drinking, Actually, it says you can't drink wine, whiskey, or beer. So you can have a martini or.
Fish drinks.
Yeah.
No keeping company with men. You gotta keep hours between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. It's okay. No loitering downtown at the ice cream parlors. No smoking.
Yeah. So.
Or the contract would be void. So yeah, it was just a cute little.
Yeah.
No riding in carriages with a man.
No dyeing your hair.
Yeah.
Yeah. No thing.
No
So this
wearing
is-
2 petticoats.
So, yeah. No. You must wear 2 petticoats.
Oh,
You have to.
Oh, 2 wear 2 petticoats. Oh my gosh.
So, I can just see it, this kind of weather, and you have to wear 2 petticoats.
Yeah.
Okay.
But who's gonna inspect to figure out if you've got 2 petticoats on?
Yeah.
Lift that.
Well, if I didn't like the teacher, I might complain.
That was my mother's.
But anyway, that's like 100 years ago, so that's, kind
It was just something.
that doesn't seem very long ago, right?
No.
So-
No. That was in my mother's file.
Oh, that's where that came
That
from.
comes
from
Oh,
her.
I thought I saw this before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I handed it over.
Yeah.
I share.
It was just fun.
Okay, I'm done, thanks.
All right, you're up.
Okay.
I'm gonna,
Okay, go and get rid of this. Okay, so I'm just gonna switch this here. This. Those. Oops. There we go. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you're.
Okay, I'm hoping there won't be feedback. So my name's Rhyno. I've lived in Windsor since 1993. I came here with 3 kids under 5 in a 1990s tempo. In 1993, I drove from St. John's, Newfoundland with no air conditioning, and that was my
Point it up here.
introduction.
Point it away from me.
Oh,
It's not you, it's the speaker.
you know, I have 3 kids. I can talk pretty loud. I don't know. Do you want me to go without the mic?
No,
Well, if he's gonna do that, yes.
move it away from him. No,
Oh,
move the speaker away from him.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the whole speaker. I talked about
That's what I said,
that.
over there, move it away from him.
Yeah.
Well, if you
okay.
can get
well,
really loud and
Yeah, I'll
just
just
be
talk
loud.
loudly.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Very
Use your
good.
teacher voice.
The you're in trouble voice, okay. So I work as a systems librarian at the University of Windsor, which means I work a lot with IT, and I tend to get into rabbit holes with technology. So I'm hopeful I won't go too far into any for this presentation. I'm also on the board of something called Our Digital World, and I'm just curious, have any of you ever heard of Our Digital World? So Our Digital World used to be something called Our Ontario, and it was one of 6 projects of a greater project called Knowledge Ontario. Knowledge Ontario was funded by the provincial government in 2006. It was coordinated by the Ontario Library Association, and many of the people who are involved with Our Digital World come from the Ontario Library Association, including me. It was defunded in 2011, and Our Digital World is sort of the successor to Our Ontario. The group of us that were working on Our Ontario, which is totally related to local history and empowering local history organizations, we felt the work was just too important not to keep it going. So we made it a standalone nonprofit, and it's sort of been operating as a standalone nonprofit since 2011. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but that's sort of the history of Our Digital World. Whenever I talk about newspapers, I love talking about this guy, Henry Grant. I'm just curious, have any of you ever heard of Henry Grant? So Henry Grant was the publisher of the Western Herald. And the Western Herald, it's confusing because there were 2 in Essex County. There was one in Sandwich, which Henry Grant ran. There was also one a couple decades later in Amherstburg. And I don't think there are any copies of the Amherstburg one in existence. But Henry Grant was fascinating to me. And I should mention I have a couple newspaper connections. So my mother worked for a once very proud daily in Nova Scotia called the New Glasgow Evening News in the 70s. It's reduced to a weekly website now. But I sort of grew up with knowing what the publishing cycle was like, even in my household. And then I married into a newspaper family. My wife, Lori Brett, was a 4th generation newspaper editor, publisher. She and I owned the Essex Free Press for 10 years. and we took it over from her dad. And she lived and breathes newspapers, and she's one of those people who can read text backwards and do typesetting and stuff. She's just, it's in her blood. I'm not quite there, but I'm somewhat familiar with it. Anyway, any newspaper publisher tends to love Henry Grant, because Henry Grant was one of the very few publishers who always said exactly how he felt about everything in his newspaper. And this is just typical of the kind of thing he would write. So, on October 16th, 1838, Henry wrote, "We have toiled unceasingly ever since we had the misfortune to cast our lot among a community of idlers and blank. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ascalon, that we have printed and published the Western Herald and Farmers Magazine 33 weeks for barely 150 subscribers. Can it be supposed that we can or will be fool enough to waste our time, health, comfort, peace of mind, and bodily labor for another year in the matter we have done, and for so contemptible a number of subscribers? Never, never." Now, this was his message to his subscriber base. And I've always been fascinated by Henry Grant because he had a lot of advice for the people who read his newspaper. And one of my favorites was the Printer's 10 Commandments. And you can hunt this down if you're interested. I'm only going to read one of them. But if you've ever been involved in publishing, these are brilliant. But the 5th commandment is, "Thou shalt not borrow thy neighbor's newspaper, but go to him that hath to sell, and buy for thyself." Yeah, just brilliant. And Henry's message, 181 years later, is probably more relevant now than ever before. And I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in this room how much trouble newspapers are in right now. The Guelph Mercury in 2016, it was probably the first shockwave to go through the newspaper community. The Guelph Mercury was a very established historic newspaper, and I think people were in disbelief that it actually closed its doors. And now it's like every week another newspaper hits the dust. So these are just some recent closings, and there's been even more since I put this list together. I mean, it is just shocking right now. And it's not just Ontario, it's everywhere, it's all across Canada. I was recently in my hometown of Colborne, in Nova Scotia, and almost all the newspapers in Nova Scotia have disappeared except for one or two. I mean, it's a very, very tough time for newspapers, especially the little community ones. And it's the community the ones that I'm the most interested in and do the most work in. And because I think they're extremely valuable, especially for family research and for local research. So we apply for a lot of grants, as I'm sure OGS does, and all of the organizations represented here. And one of our grants required us to put in a sentence what the importance of community newspapers were. So this is something we came up with. We said it's a footprint for nearly every sports team, community event, church, social, business opening, closing, birth, marriage, death, celebration, criminal action, expansion, decline, opinions, gatherings, elections, trends, weather patterns, and more, and much more. I mean, newspapers are pure gold for historic research. And one of the things I love about newspapers, I'm really fascinated by advertising. I did a little work in that area in the Free Press, and I'm always fascinated when it's done well. But one of the things advertising does is it captures transitions really well, especially societal transitions. So in 1922, in the Essex Free Press, when Ford did its advertising, it wasn't competing with other car companies. Guess what it was competing with? Horses, exactly, yeah. And one of the points it made, when you own a Ford, you can do away with the many articles that are a source of continuous expense for owning a horse. For instance, not only your driving horse and buggy, but the single harness, blankets, whips, curry combs, brushes, horseshoes, pitchforks, bee-bins, etc. It is vastly superior to the narrow, cramped buggy that travels so closely, and I love this line the best. And when a Ford is standing idle, it does not eat 3 meals a day and requires no looking after. And I mean, that's the kind of thing you find in newspapers, and they capture that kind of stuff well. But my all-time favorite are health ads, and those of you who've looked at local newspapers. And for the most part, a lot of health products in the 19th century and early 20th century were sort of broke down by gender. If you were a man, particularly a young man, you had the great danger of suffering the ills of self-abuse. And this is an advertisement from the Chatham Planet in the 1800s. And it reads, I'll just read part of this. Those who have injured themselves by a certain practice indulged in when alone, a habit frequently learned from evil companions, are at school, the effects of which are nightly felt even when asleep, and if not cured, renders marriage impossible and destroys both mind and body, should apply immediately. Self-abuse is one of the most formidable enemies to health, for nothing else in the dire catalog of human diseases causes so destructive a drain upon the human system. And I love the way it ends. Happiness, it leaves the sufferer wrecked in body and mind, predisposed to consumption, and a train of evils more to be dreaded than death itself. I mean, that really, really comes on strong. If you were a woman, you probably suffered from nervous conditions. And there are many, many ads. And women would have to brave death for social honors. This is from the Border City Star, I think it's about 1918. And many of these health products were vegetable compounds of some sort or another. Probably harmless, hopefully. But what I liked about this particular one, it actually had testimonials that you could have tracked down if you lived in the Windsor area. That was rare. Most of them had testimonials that were just far enough away that you would probably never check them. Some exotic place like Sarnia, right? That would be the testimony. So anyway, love the ads. Want to put in a plug too for the printery. Have any of you ever been to the McKinsey printery near Niagara Falls? Wonderful place to go if you're interested in newspapers themselves, their history. But one of the things I love there is they actually have some of these health products on display. And if you looked at old newspapers, you would have seen Dawes kidney pills. Dawes kidney pills probably have the longest run of any historic product, but they actually have a box of them. And if you shake the box, they are actually in there. I was joking with my wife, we could be totally healthy by the time we get home if we took some of these Dawes kidney pills, because they cured everything, apparently. Anyway, great place to go. So, newspapers. There's something called the National Heritage Digitization Strategy. I'm sure OGS was consulted about it. Libraries and Archives Canada is working on this. It's the idea of setting priorities for what materials should be digitized. And in their survey, they found that newspapers were by far the most highly prioritized material. Although most often cited by genealogists, newspapers appear to be a priority regardless of profession. And that's been my experience. Everybody is keen on digitizing newspapers. It's hard to find funding still, but the priorities seems to be well slanted towards newspapers. And why there isn't more of it happening and why the projects are somewhat rare is the cost of newspaper digitization. And these figures can be hard to come by, but this is one of the few that I've ever seen in print. And this comes from Chronicling America, which I'll talk about. Chronicling America is the biggest public newspaper project in the world, and of course from the United States. But the estimate there is somewhere around $3 US per page. Now the kind of work I do and I'm involved in, we do things much more cheaply than that. But that is what Chronicling America runs for doing a single page. So you can imagine how quickly that adds up for something that's prolific as a newspaper run, especially a daily newspaper. This figure came from an article about a gentleman named Tom Treninsky, who's sort of a hero to me. He digitizes newspapers in his home. He's digitized about 50 million newspapers, which is 50 million pages of newspapers, which is an incredible number for an individual. And he has a website called FultonHistory.com. Have any of you ever been to FultonHistory.com? If you're researching a family that has American connections, he has some Canadian newspapers, not many though, they're mostly US papers. You can find treasure troves here. It's one of the most bizarre websites I've ever used, but it is actually getting easier to use. The trick to know, if you go to Fulton History, is the links are here, where it has the 1, 2, 3, 4. You have to hover over it and click on it, and that's how you get to the different options. He used to have a spider with his head on it that would go from here to here. And you would have to click on it as it went by to get into the site. It was like literally the most bizarre site I've ever known. But he does incredible work. So I really recommend this site if you're looking, especially if your family has US roots. And I know that's very common in this area. My work has been mostly behind a site called Ink. Have any of you ever heard of Ink? Okay. Ink is starting to show its age pretty badly, and I'll talk a bit about that. But it really started in 2007 with this gentleman named Aaron Schwartz. Aaron Schwartz is sort of an internet hero. He sort of had a very tragic life. But I had the tremendous honor to be seated beside him at an event for the Internet Archive. And Aaron was sort of fascinated. This all happened in 2007. It was during the time my wife and I owned the Essex Free Press. And he was fascinated that I owned a newspaper. And he said to me, how would I feel if someone took my archive and put it online? And I said, I'd be thrilled if anybody would go to that much work. So I had Aaron Schwartz on one side of me, and I had Brewster Kale, the head of the Internet Archive, on the other side of me. And he sort of leaned in and said, the Internet Archive's interested in working with newspapers. Why don't we do something together? So the very first newspapers we did were with the Internet Archive. They're still there. And we did a pilot project with them. And this all happened in 2007. Unfortunately, with the Internet Archive, at the time, they didn't have a way to break apart the newspapers. So you would search in their search engine and you would download an entire reel at a time. And the reel's about 1,000 pages. It was very cumbersome to work with. So we had the idea, let's digitize with the Internet Archive, but let's build a different system to search it. And that system was Ink. And this was the second generation of Ink I'm showing here. And I'm hopeful we'll get to a third generation of it. So the very first paper I ever worked on, of course, was my own. I convinced my wife, why don't we pay to get this digitized with the Internet Archive? And she was willing to do so. And the Essex Free Press is pretty typical of a small town Ontario newspaper. It's just over 70,000 pages. It was a weekly for most of its existence, an 8-page weekly for most of that time. And these are the formats that it was in. So mostly in microfilm, some in microfiche, and just the last couple of years we had the PDFs for the newspaper, and they were a joy to work with. Now, I had a group of students a week ago last Friday giving a library tour, and I always like to ask them questions to figure out what their tech experience is. Do they own a laptop? Do they own a tablet? I asked them if any of them, we were in the media room of the Liddy Library, had any of them ever used microfilm or microfiche? Guess how many put up their hands? Not one. I couldn't believe it. It was the first year, not one of them put up their hand. In fact, some of them were pulling out the microfilm. They didn't believe it was a thing. It was like, is this a movie? How does this thing work?
You should have asked them if they'd ever read a newspaper.
Good point.
One thing I wanted to point out here too, if you have really good eyes, you'll see the years here go 1921, 1922, 1924, 1925. 1923 is missing, and there was the practice at the Free Press to loan out volumes to the public, and then they would return them again. And in 1976, 1923 walked out the door and never came back again, and it's lost. We've never been able to find it again. And that's how fragile a lot of this content is. The other thing I want to say about microfilm is, unfortunately for a lot of little newspapers, a lot of community newspapers, a lot of them threw away the paper when they get the microfilm. They did it to save space. And that's the real tragedy, because as bad as this is all we have in a lot of cases. So one of the things we discovered, we sort of had this goal, well, let's digitize every newspaper in Essex County. How hard can it be? And we had passed well over the 500,000 mark by the time, when Knowledge Ontario ran out of money, we were at about this point. And this is not even touching the Windsor Star at this point. This is a lot of local papers. Essex County in particular, I mean, everywhere in Ontario, you'd be amazed how many newspapers there are. But Essex County had a lot of newspapers. It was a very prolific area for newspapers, and good newspapers, really, really interesting newspapers. So one of the things we've had to grapple with a lot is the challenges of microfilm. I'm assuming, is there anyone here who hasn't used microfilm or fiche? I don't think I've ever met anyone who's into family history who hasn't used film or fiche, but it's always possible. But as you know, microfilm can have really interesting variations. And this is a sample, and these are mostly local papers. But so my paper was microfilmed in the 80s. Community newspapers didn't tend to be as microfilmed as well as major dailies. So we have these things like sometimes it's 1 page, sometimes it's 2 pages, sometimes it was a good camera shot, sometimes it was really bad. Some were just done poorly from the get-go. Provincial Freeman's a good example of this. This is an Amherstburg paper, which is pretty much unreadable, but that was what was done for the microfilm. And my favorite is these kind of things. This is Marine Record, which was sort of a Great Lakes newspaper. But they would put 8 and 16 pages in one camera shot. And what a pain it is to extract all those and pull them together again. And not even clean shots, like this would be down here, and the other part of it would be up here. So that's the kind of thing you deal with microfilm. If you're searching newspaper collections, you really have to be aware of how weak some of the technology is behind newspapers, especially those that come from microfilm and microfiche. So this would be typical, the kind of thing you would find in a digitized newspaper page. When we first started working with newspapers, we would get about 1/4 of the words accurately with optical character recognition. And that's what all the newspaper projects use to expose the text for searching. We eventually got up to 50% of the words. And right now we can get about 75% of the words from film. Fiche is another world of pain. I'll talk a bit about it as well. But it means if you search for something and you don't find it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. Really important with family names. I don't know, like the Border City Star, I remember someone being outraged with me. They could not find any McDonald's in 1 year of the Border City Star. Well, they were there, but it didn't come through in the OCR. Very common problem. So it's important if you're searching for names, especially if you're looking for 2 names, to understand a little bit about how the indexing works. Most search engines are relevancy engines. That's what Google uses, and they reward pages with a lot of the same term with higher weights. It's why when you search Wilfrid Laurier, for example, you might get a page with lots of Lauriers, but nothing to do with Wilfrid Laurier. And if you go into the advanced search of almost any of the newspaper collections, you'll probably have a proximity setting or something with similar wording. And you should set that, I'd say, between 10 and 15 words. With a lot of books, you can go down to say, I want words within 2 words of each other. But it's trickier with newspapers because of the columns. Especially older newspapers. Older newspapers tended to have a lot more columns. We have some in Essex County that had 8 columns on a page. We have a few that had 16 columns on a page. So what words are beside each other when you have that many columns is a little bit tricky. So set this to a good level. But if you do that, then you're more likely to have this kind of thing happen. You're more likely to get a full name. And I think that's important if you're doing family research and you're looking for a specific individual. The other thing I wanted to mention is Fussy Setting. Again, most newspaper projects have a setting like this. Even Ancestry has something like this. Ancestry embeds this kind of technology, so you don't need to set it emphatically with it, but with many systems you do. This is very important with newspaper scans, especially when the newspaper is not a good scan, and you'll see a lot of that, where there's a lot of dirt on the film, or it just hasn't come through very well. And this is a good example. Schofield Sun-Tribune was digitized by a grant in the 90s, and they ran out of money after they got it scanned. And what they gave me was the scans. They had no money left. So I picked it up like 10 years after it was done. And this is what the content looks like. And you'll see it's a bit of a mess. But if you have a fussy setting, and that's what these little numbers here mean beside the words, you have a much better chance of finding what you're looking for. But like I say, if you don't, sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
These are settings within Inc?
Yes, they're within Inc. They're within most of them. There's not that many big public newspaper sites. I'm going to show you, I think there are 4 that I'm aware of that are big, but they all have this sort of thing, and it's useful to know. But yeah, in Inc. it's called Fuzzy. Yeah, they often have weird names too.
So 0.5 would be your recommendation to set that at?
Yeah, that's what I would use on Inc. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you can try with no settings. It's only if you don't find something you think is there. And I find, especially people doing family research, they usually know. Like they say, oh, well, my relative appeared in 1984 or 1922. I know they did. And they're often right. So this is the last invoice we have at the university for something we paid to get scanned. At the time, it was one of the cheapest places we could find to scan. It was about $35 a reel, very reasonable price for microfilm scanning. But of course, they went out of business. And right now, it costs about $60 a reel for microfilm scanning. $60 a reel is about 1,000 pages normally. It's not a lot of money. Very tricky though when you don't really tend to have much of a budget. So we had this goal that we had to figure out how to scan more cheaply. And one of the things we've done at the university is we come up with a sort of a prototype for a $2,000 microfilm scanner. We wanted it to be $1,000, but we couldn't do it for less than $2,000. And I wouldn't bother going, this is more of a tech thing, but we were just trying to find a way to do it cheaply. And our goal was something that could scan 1 reel a day unattended. We didn't care if it took between 1 hour and 6 hours, as long as we could load a reel in the morning and then come back the next day and load another reel. That's what we wanted. Because we figured this would be the kind of thing that would allow some grassroots scanning. And we were inspired, we had this sort of MacGyver inspiration. And I know there's a remake of MacGyver, but of course I associate it with the 1980s MacGyver. And we came up with a prototype. I have video of it. I won't show it because I don't think there's time. But it was basically based on macro photography. So macro photography is like what you use when you take pictures of insects and stuff like that. It's for taking pictures of little things. We discovered that if you used a macro lens with a bright enough light source, that you could get quite a good shot of microfilm. But the big breakthrough was this thing here. Does anyone know what that is? It's a rotisserie motor, and that's how we move the reel. The Essex County Youth Soccer League, one of my kids was the head of it for a while, and I was barbecuing for the team. And I was looking at the rotisserie engine, and it suddenly dawned on me, that's exactly what I need for microfilm. Because the great thing about a rotisserie engine is it can handle usually like a 50-pound piece of meat. It's got a lot of torque. And you need a fair amount of strength to move a microfilm reel around. Anyway, we put all this together. But we discovered that if we worked, and these are some early prototypes, and I mean, we didn't know what we were doing at first. But we discovered with macro photography, we actually had some advantages we didn't have with other types of scanning. And it largely came out in illustrations and photographs. And you can see the difference here. So this is something we paid for here, and this is something we redid with macro photography. And you can tell there's quite a difference, especially in the illustration. I'm going to harp on that a bit too, because it's one thing I criticize other newspaper projects for. I really hate when they reduce images to black and white to improve the text, but it destroys the illustrations and the photographs. So I think you can do both. Anyway, macro photography helps support that. And this is a relatively recent example. This comes from the first reel off the Amherstburg Echo that we have in our collection. So this is their $60 scan of it. Amherstburg Echo was not microfilm really well, even though I think it's maybe the best newspaper that ever came out of Essex County. And this is from macro photography. So you can see we're actually starting to get pretty good results with this kind of approach. Now, I want to mention about Microfiche. Now, I know you've all used microfilm. Have any of you used Microfiche? Oh, some of you have, yeah. Fiche is way worse than microfilm. And the worst thing is, if you're looking at papers, especially since 1969, especially community newspapers, most community newspapers after 1969 switched from microfilm to microfiche. And they did so because it was a lot cheaper to do. But unfortunately, it led to things like this. Fiche is horrendous when it's scanned, even from a commercial provider. Many public newspaper projects won't touch Fiche. Many scanning vendors won't deal with Fiche either. It's a bit of a niche market to begin with. But we're starting to have some luck trying to improve it as well. Anyway, I'm really keen to solve this one because almost all of the local newspapers that are post-1969 have holdings in Fiche, like the Harrow News, for example. So I'd really like to figure out a way to make this work. This tends to be more expensive as well. So these are some of the papers that we recently worked on. I'll mention the Harrow News. the Tilbury Times. We're sort of have this model that we're moving up the 401 and trying to do all the newspapers as we move. So we've moved into Tilbury, great paper. Farmer's Son is out of London. I did some of these because they were in our collection. The Farmer's Son's sort of a fascinating one too, but I really loved the Echo. And we had 49 reels of the Echo in the Liddy Library collection, but there were 12 reels the Marsh collection had that we did not have, and they loaned them to me to scan. And they scan quite well. I have an example of a photograph here, at some point. And basically we continue to scan. We have a huge bottleneck of getting these things online, largely because of funding issues. But we probably, at this point, we were close to 2 million. We're probably closer to 3 million pages at this point. And that's pretty big. And most of those are Essex County newspapers, so a huge collection. But our hope is eventually to do this sort of Great Lakes motif, that we tried to do all the newspapers sort of around the Great Lakes. I sort of wanted something to unify the project because we started to do some papers in Michigan too, and those, and all of you know, have done family research on both sides of the border. The borders were very porous for a very long time. So for example, there are some Detroit papers that covered Sandwich Council. Like, you know, that's how close the relationships were across the border. So it's important to do both of them if we can. But this is my big thing. This would be a nightmare for most scanning because a picture of a person against a dark background on microfilm is just about the worst case scenario you can imagine. And this is not perfect, but this is remarkably good for this type of scanning. So I'm very eager to solve this one because anything since the early 30s, you're very likely to find more photographs. And I never get a happier email from anyone than when they use ink and they find a picture of a relative they've never seen before. And you know, sometimes these only exist on microfilm. And this is another example. So this is my paper. This is what we paid for to get done the first time. And this is what we can do now. And you can tell the difference is pretty dramatic. And again, it's the pictures that I'm really interested in, trying to rescue these somehow. That's just Essex County's probably only axe murder, but I won't go into that. So within ink, we're trying to re-OCR a lot of our pages. This is one of the things about technology. It's always improving all the time. And I think if you're in a digitization project, half the battle is to redo what you already did about 10 years ago. So that's what we're doing now. We have to move to a new platform. And we're trying to leverage font metrics for searching. And what that means is that you'd be more likely to get headlines when you search. So like if you were searching Kaiser, you would get the headline before an article where the Kaiser is mentioned and things like that. It just sort of puts the headlines and subtitles up to the front. And these are some of the standards we're working with. I won't go into any of these except this one. This is a standard that comes out of Chronicling America. Chronicling America is, like I say, the biggest public newspaper project in the world. And this is a standard they use for the outputs off their work. Why this is so valuable, it allows two different digitization projects to share the same newspapers. So if I wanted to give the Essex Free Press to Chronicling America, I would use the NDNP standard. I don't think they want it, but that's what would make it happen. And this is the URL for Chronicling America. Again, American focus. A lot of local families have American connections. Well worth checking out. Even if you think you won't find someone there, it's amazing how often you will. Chronicling America is just over 15 million pages. And like I say, it's the biggest public project currently running outside of Tom's project. But Fulton History, it's not quite clear how public it is. Chronicling America is definitely a fully public project and a well-funded project. A lot of money goes behind it. It's a very well-done project. And if you go into the advanced search, you can do some of the things I mentioned before, especially setting a number of words within each other. So again, I'd highly recommend this one if you think you have any American connections. And I'd like to say a lot of local families, that seems to be true. But the one I wanted to mention as well is Google Newspaper. So did anyone use the Google Newspaper Archive when it was running? Okay. It's a fascinating one to me. It's actually the biggest one. They digitized 60 million pages for the Google Newspaper Archive, and a lot of those newspapers came from Ontario and Quebec, so it's quite a relevant project. It's sort of an interesting one too, because I think it shows some of the hazards of when the commercial world takes over newspaper digitization. So there was this system called paper record, which ironically it exists again, but it sort of went dark when Google acquired all of its newspapers. It came back again, the Google Newspaper Archive. And the Google News Project operated for about 2 years. It started in 2009 and it shut down in 2011. So Google had the goal to digitize the world's newspapers. And you know it's a big goal when even Google can't achieve it. Even Google, which makes like $110 million every couple minutes, even they couldn't do this. So it's a fascinating one to me, but I wanted to mention it too because it still exists. It's a little hard to find, but if you can get to it, you can still take advantage of all the work they've done. And they did a lot of Ontario newspapers, they did a lot of Quebec newspapers, and a lot of US newspapers as well. And you know, they did them very well. When they shut down, I contacted Google to find out if I could get the Ontario newspapers in that collection, because there was this tantalizing press release that they would share the images they had built for this project. And I've been talking to them for 8 years now, trying to get those newspapers, and I still believe I might get them someday. But I mean, this is a very well done project. It's really a shame it didn't come to fruition, but it's still there. There's a URL too. We have a project at the library called CDIGS. It's a Center for Digital Scholarship. And on the server, we put together a list of Ontario newspapers in the Google News Archive. So there are about 800,000 Ontario newspapers, newspaper pages in the Google News Archive. And a lot of local papers, including the Border City Star and the Windsor Star. So very worthwhile using the Google News Archive if you're doing family research. Of course, I've got to mention Ancestry. So Ancestry doesn't tend to do newspapers per se. They pull out obituaries from newspapers. What they do, they don't do a lot of in sheer newspaper terms, but they do very well. And I suspect I don't have to tell anybody about how this works here. I'm sure you all use Ancestry. But Ancestry is a good source of a lot of newspaper content. Again, it tends to be limited to notices and obituaries, births, marriages, and deaths. But what they do, they do well. And of course, Newspapers.com. I want to mention Newspapers.com because to me, they're a little bit scary in that I bet as a lot of these newspapers start closing, I'm guessing Newspapers.com is looking pretty attractive to the big corporations behind some of these newspapers. But they don't have a lot of community content. They tend to do daily newspapers, at least so far, and it's a subscription service. I should ask, have any of you ever used Newspapers.com? You have? Okay. It's not that expensive, and they do a good job. But again, their focus tends to be on bigger newspapers, at least at this point. And one of the papers they do is the Windsor Star. The Windsor Star actually is quite remarkable how many projects have worked with it. And there's some promise there will be a lot more Ontario newspapers at least out there. Back in 2016, the Archives of Ontario put out a request for information. And what they were proposing was to digitize the 10,000 newspaper reels in their collection, about 10 million pages of Ontario newspaper content. And that would cover almost every community newspaper in existence that's in microfilm in Ontario. Now, unfortunately, nothing else has happened since then, and with the current provincial government, maybe nothing's going to happen for a while. But this would be just wonderful if this ever came together. And my impression is they are working towards this. So my hope is someday the Archives of Ontario will follow through with this. I also wanted to mention a bit about newspaper archives. I had the good fortune to be interviewed by CBC London back in December of 2017. And just before that, Postmedia and Torstar had swapped 41 newspapers. It was at the end of November of 2017, and they shut down 36 of those 41 papers. So 5 papers survived, and everything else was shut down. And the focus of the interview was digitization in a time of newspapers shut down. So this led to me approaching the Ontario Library Association. We put together a letter which we sent to Post Media and Torstar, sort of pleading with them to think about what they're going to do with their archives as they shut down newspapers. Because the impression at the time was some of them were getting lost. So, and you know, some very big papers were the Barrie Examiner, Petrolia Topic, like fairly established newspapers. There was great concern, well, what happens to the archives of those newspapers? Because in addition to the printed page that comes out of newspaper offices, almost every newspaper that's ever existed has an archive of some kind. And those are the photos that didn't get published, those are the background materials for those stories. You know, those things are pure gold.
The Windsor Star has something called the Tombs,
Yeah.
which everybody has heard about, but very few of us ever have seen them. My aunt was one of the Star photographers. She told us that they existed, and she said they were just sitting around in the 1950s and 1960s in the dusty piles down in the basement. And you could literally go back and find out exactly what the reporters, you know, were writing in their little journals before it showed up in the newspapers.
Yeah, and you know, any politician, any person of note has an entry, most times in an archive with some of their background, and like great photographers that were never put in the paper.
But the thing is, what they've lost is the fact that what the actual reporters, knowing these people personally, put down in their books and weren't allowed to publish.
Yeah. Yeah, and you got to remember, like in the 70s, the Windsor Star was like over 120 employees. Like, it was a big newspaper. I think there are 16 or 17 now. I mean, a different world. So anyway, incredibly, Post Media and Torstar have been fairly responsive with this group. We continue to meet, and our most recent meeting was just last week, and we're working towards establishing a template for transferring the collections to cultural heritage institutions of some kind, libraries, archives. And you know, our message was we don't care where it goes, as long as a safe home for that collection and not a dumpster. That's the most important thing with these archives. And the papers that were shut down, Libraries and Archives Canada, which participates in our group, they did some research on it just to find out where some of the papers were. And 13 of the 36 they couldn't find anywhere. So the archives of those, the back pages of those newspapers are just sort of lost right now. So a little scary. You would think when you lose newspapers, it's from 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But a lot of it's happening right now as newspapers are closing down. But there's some promising signs. So some of you may be aware of this, that London Free Press donated its archives to London Public Library. This was a very promising development. This happened in May. I love this quote from the editor-in-chief of the London Free Press. It may be a digital world now, but there's decades of London's history carefully organized in those paper files and microfilm, and we want to make sure every Londoner who would like it, who would like to, has access to it. And I mean, hopefully this kind of thing will continue. What's happened in London, and I think this is fairly typical, is the downsizing. The newspapers are having smaller staff, moved into the smaller offices, and the archives are too big to take with them, so they need some place to put them. And libraries are an excellent place for that. And this is the Windsor Star Archive. The Windsor Star Archive is about 68 archives, about 170 square feet. I had the opportunity to look through these. You would be thrilled to go through these. There's so much great photography and background materials. So, you know, the Metropolitan Fire, I'm sure you're all aware of. There are photos in that archive that were never published, but they're all in there. So anyway, the University of Windsor, we're talking to Post Media. We're very hopeful that we could get this collection moved to the university when they move to smaller offices. What's interesting about this archive, so those 68 cabinets were moved by one guy up to the top floor. They had no elevator on the last floor. And this one guy carried every one of these up and put them in place. And I met him. I thought he'd be like, you know, a gorilla. Just a skinny guy. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, have great hope for that collection, because some really good stuff there.
Are those the actual newspapers in that collection,
No,
or
it-
just microfilm?
So it's a little bit of both. So the microfilm, no, it's not the newspaper, it's not the microfilm off their published product. And we have those at the University of Windsor, and we're talking to them. The Windsor Star is our only active microfilm subscription. It's literally the only microfilm we still continue to get, is the Windsor Star. But this is the thing, so the photos that you see on a printed page, those originals aren't here. There's a lot of negatives for things that were just, they never developed them, so a lot of the negatives are in this collection somewhere. And like I say, a lot of background information, you know, sort of the first draft of stories.
Like I was able to get a picture that was back in the 1940s, but when I tried to get a picture of something that was more recent, I was told that they don't keep the photos anymore.
Yeah, I think what they don't do is they don't produce a printed copy of the photo, but they probably have a negative or digital file of it. And to be honest, this was a very well-maintained collection, is my understanding, up to, you know, the last 20 years. I think they even had 2 or 3 librarians working on this collection at one time. But I think, you know, it's like teenagers. I think things just sort of get shoved in there in later years. So I bet a lot of what's here, no one really knows until they go through it. But yeah, there would be, you know, those, at least the negatives would be there somewhere.
And where is that located?
That's on the top floor of the Windsor Star building.
But it's not open to the public.
No, it's not. No, no, no. But if we got it at the Windsor Star, we would make it a public collection somehow. But, yeah. Anyway, we're talking to them, and this story is being repeated all across Ontario because so many newspapers are shutting down. They're either shutting down or they're moving to smaller spaces. Malcolm.
I used to work at Channel 9 TV. Gino Conte was the lead
Oh, I know, Gino.
radio television reporter. He had files like that of anything that was important out of the Windsor Star, that he clipping files of what he thought was important. And of course, Gino was probably the best journalist we had there for 40 years. And a number of those full of things that he thought were important. And he's gone, retired 10 years ago or less. And I don't know what happened to those.
Oh.
Because I think the building has changed. And I don't, well, there's a new boss there who's, so I don't know. But, no, he's okay, but, I mean, he's not into that.
Yeah.
Because Gino was an old journalist, and he needed history to, you know, and we don't have people like that there anymore.
Yeah, and you know, there was a time when a reporter lived
Yes.
and breathed in these areas.
That's why I raised the issue
Yeah.
of Gino Conte.
Yeah.
And he and his are gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad, you know, all these major outlets are just getting smaller and, you
Well, I've
know.
been gone for 10 years too.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The London Free Press photographs are at the University of Windsor in their special, or at the University of Western in their special collections, and they're in refrigerators
Yeah,
to protect them.
yeah.
It is fabulous to see that collection and the rows and how high it is in that special collections place, but they've got all of the photographs. So if you know of a specific time period that your family were probably in the newspaper, there could be extra pictures that they had of the same event, but they just never made the paper.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
Toronto
they're in
Telegraph,
special
David and I were
collections there.
talking about that. It's the same thing. They gave their photographs to York University. And the London Free Press transfer was after that. So they did work out an arrangement with Western.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ideal, to have something that well taken
But
care of.
refrigerated even.
Yeah, yeah.
It, just
Yeah.
one whole wall, longer than that.
Yeah, I bet. Sorry, Malcolm and then,
Yeah. Again, my daughter now works for the Windsor Star.
oh yeah,
She's a journalist photographer. We give her an extra $15 a week to be a photographer.
yeah.
But she takes things on digitally, of course. And of course, they only print, they don't even print pictures anymore. They put them in the paper, but they're never printed. But of course, all of the photographs she takes are saved digitally, although I don't know anything about it, but I know they're all saved. And, well, how many sticks does it take to save 1,000 pictures?
Yeah, that's the irony too. Sometimes the things at the most risk is not ancient technology, it's recent technology, right?
Yeah, it's hard to dig through that stuff to find the picture of that thing.
Yeah.
When I originally started back in the 90s, I had to go not only to the Windsor Public Library, but when the Windsor Public Library didn't have a microfilm, they would access the Essex County one on, is it Fairview Street in Essex?
Yeah.
So have you done any of the newspapers that are there, or the microfilms that are there?
Yeah, so we worked quite a bit. So the university, incredibly, has a lot of local newspapers, which, you know, is not typical of university libraries. They often don't have to
I've
look.
gone to the university, I do still use the microfilms, but I was wondering if they had anything that was over and above special at the Essex County, because they kept on doing this hide and seek thing on many of the archaeologists or the genealogists in this county. It was like, oh no, it's not here, it's there. No, it's not here, it's there. And then people were telling me it's all being hoarded in Essex.
Yeah, it's sort of like, so the Essex branch of microfilm, you have to get, I think my understanding is from head office, we've done the Chatham Daily News and we've done the Essex Record. And that.
And the Conver,
Oh,
yes,
right.
the Conver newspaper.
Yeah.
That was also very good.
So we're trying to get everything that we don't have from them. I mean, the unfortunate thing is when you get microfilm from a public library, unfortunately it's not the best place to get it because it's so used and scratched or dirty that sometimes it's not the best. But you know, sometimes they have the only copy that exists, so, you know, as bad as
Of course, the old machines that you're reading against were also pretty archaic.
Well, this is why I'm so interested in coming up with a cheap scanning solution, because it's actually cheaper to scan it and make it available than to force people to use those horrendous microfilm readers, which are expensive and break a lot. Yeah. I was in Welland 2 weeks ago at the Welland Public Library using the Welland Tribune, and there were 6 of us jockeying for 2 microfilm readers, right? And I'm sure all of you have been through this, right? And those things are expensive as heck and painful to use. So I'd really like to eradicate them and just make it all digital if possible. My boss, who's pictured here, Pascal, he has agreed to support our digital world. It's been a bit of a volunteer project for me all these years, but he's allowed me to put some of my time into it. So my hope is we can sort of ramp up the kind of work we're doing in Inc., do more local newspapers, do more work on the platform, and we hope this is sort of a start of a trend. I think the public libraries have been very good in Ontario about trying to support newspaper digitization. I'm really keen on getting the universities to do that as well, because I think there is a good synergy there with university research. Okay, I'm just going to check my time here. How am I doing? Good? Okay. So my favorite newspaper project in the world is not the biggest, it's not that relevant to this audience, but, and I can't even read most of the content they do, but it's the National Library of Luxembourg. Luxembourg, a country of like 500,000 people, they do absolutely the best job of newspaper digitization. And they just have these brilliant ideas of what to do with historic newspapers. So one of the things they do is they make newspapers available as data. So if you're doing research, if you're doing social science research and you want to crunch newspaper content for your research, they make it very easy to do so. And I think it's really brilliant. And this is the kind of thing they do. They put together these packs, and their newspaper titles all put together in a very clear format that allows researchers, you know, people who aren't going to sit at the microfilm machine and read things necessarily, but want to use software for crunching the content of newspapers. And they were the first ones to do it, and they still do it the best. Anyway, I have 2 examples here. So this is from an economist who works for PricewaterhouseCoopers. We have a PricewaterhouseCoopers office here in Windsor, which one of my kids works for, so I always got to plug them. But the economist was looking at food prices in Luxembourg. And what they did is they went through the historic newspapers, identified everything with food prices, and then crunched the numbers that they were seeing there. And then for the 1870s, the period they were dealing with, this was the only source that exists for this kind of thing. So I think this is a really fascinating area. In Austria, the University of Rostock is looking at social trends during the First World War. And one of the things they were trying to do was track how many widows and orphans were in Austria during the First World War. And they're looking at ads from newspapers. So this is an ad for a woman who's 40 saying she's available to maintain a household. And she identifies herself as a widow. And that was very common in the newspapers at the time. So this is the kind of thing, this I think is the bridge to academia with historic newspapers and community newspapers. So my hope is these kind of examples will lead to more universities supporting newspaper projects, because I think that's the missing piece we need right now. Anyway, I'm going to end here. This is a picture of my father-in-law. He's no longer with us. And this is the press in the Free Press from the 70s. At the Essex Free Press, we used workflows, some of them that came from the 1800s. We would tie things with baling twine. We would mix our own glue with a recipe that was at the paper for over 100 years and keep it in the fridge. I always remember that, opening the fridge and seeing glue. But that's sort of how we're digitizing right now. It's a little bit when I have the rotisserie motor with the reel going through. It's not much different than how we used to publish the newspaper. And to me, that sort of brings things full circle. Anyway, I love that shot because I love his. I love his. I love his hand.
A little off topic of maybe newspapers, but say you wrote, and you find a newspaper and you want to take a picture of that for your records. Would it be better to take your camera out and do a JPEG and then convert that to PDF and get that searchable, or they have these scanning apps now on phone? Would it be better to scan it as a PDF and then make it searchable? Or I'm just wondering for us when we're out on the.
So if you're looking at a physical newspaper, so
Yes.
it's something you have your hands on the paper, your phone can do a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends too. The thing that kills OCR tends to be columns. So if you want a page and it's got like 3 or 4 columns on it, you might not, like the PDF engine might not do such a great job of the OCR. It might be worth focusing in and doing a column at a time if your intent is to get the OCR. But I mean, these things are remarkable how good the cameras are getting on them. Like my wife does all sorts of family research, and it's amazing how much she can get off her phone. And oftentimes it's the only way you can get it right. Like I was mentioning Fort Wayne, they have collections that can't leave the room, right? Like this is the only way to do it.
So should you take it as a JPEG or a PDF?
I like going JPEG first and then saving it as a PDF later. The problem with PDFs is, well, it's not really a problem, but PDFs can be sort of an odd technology. It depends on how it's captured. So PDF is based on a standard called PostScript, which is a printing kind of standard. The problem is a PDF engine can vary about how it saves something. So to save space, the PDF engine can throw away parts off the image quality. So, I like going to image format than to PDF rather than the other way around.
And so let's say we take a picture or a JPEG, and then at home we convert it to a PDF, and then make it a searchable PDF, or is there?
You can. So if you have the Adobe suite, you can certainly do that. Yeah, and it has quite a good engine. It's funny, the best OCR engines in the world right now are cloud-based engines. Google has one, Microsoft has one, and Amazon has one. And they're all very, very good engines. In Google, for example, you can upload your image and have them do the OCR processing. They're not free, however, though. Google's is remarkably cheap. I think you have to do like 1,000 pages before it's like 10 cents or something like that. But it's funny about using your phone. I was at the Great Hall at Trinity. It's this amazing library. And there's like signs all over the place. You're not allowed taking pictures. But I could not resist. And, I don't have the best phone. It's like 15 years old. So I was trying to focus it, and I realized I had a security guard right in front of me. And I was holding it like this. So there's sometimes you shouldn't use your phone. And as a librarian, I should know that better than anyone. But yeah. But yeah. Yeah, if I knew, like my kids would have figured it out. Like I just confessed.
Is it just a flash that would hurt something?
Yeah, that's what they're concerned
So
about.
if you don't use a flash, you're fine.
Yeah, but you have to convince the security people you're not going to use a flash. And to be fair, sometimes on your phone, it's not that easy. I like the old cameras that have buttons and stuff, and you always knew it was off. Sometimes if I'm on your phone, it always thinks it's smarter than you or stuff like that, so,
No, I can turn mine off.
yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to give you a little thank you
Oh,
for coming out,
awesome.
taking the
Thank you,
time.
David.
You know, he's not being paid to be here other
Yeah.
than, you know, so we really appreciate it. And are you, if you had questions, would you be
Sure, yeah,
available to
yeah,
answer them?
definitely.
So stay around, there's a little bit of refreshments back there, and cookies, and Art can maybe answer some questions, and especially anything on OCR and digitization.